The year was 1770, and the city of Boston lay cloaked in the uneasy quiet of a people simmering beneath the weight of an empire's hand, a hand that pressed harder with each passing month. And in the modest brick house of the Whitfield family near King Street, life balanced delicately between duty, loyalty, and the restless whisper of rebellion. Jonathan Whitfield, the family's patriarch, was a man of trade, his hands hardened from years spent unloading barrels of molasses and rum at the wharves, his fortune made in the maritime business that linked the colonies to the far reaches of the empire. He was a man who respected order, who paid his dues to the crown and expected stability in return, yet even he could not ignore the growing unrest that festered in the taverns, the churches, and even the homes of Boston. His wife, Margaret, carried herself with the quiet dignity of a matron accustomed to both hardship and plenty. Her days filled with tending to her household and guiding her children with a stern but loving hand. Their eldest son, Thomas, was 20, headstrong and restless, his spirit kindled by fiery sermons and pamphlets that spoke of liberty and the rights of man, words that carried a dangerous weight in a city patrolled by red-coated soldiers. Their second son, Edward, only 17, looked more to the stability of Britain, for he admired discipline, order, and the might of an empire that had only a decade before protected the colonies during the French and Indian War. Their daughter, Abigail, at 15, listened quietly to her brothers argue in the evenings, torn between fear of war and fascination with the idea that change, perhaps even greatness, might lie ahead. On the evening of March 5, 1770, the Whitfield family's life would forever change. For that night, Boston's simmering resentment boiled into violence upon the very street where Jonathan had so often walked. It was Thomas, returning from an errand near the customs house, who found himself swept into the crowd that gathered around a lone British sentry. Voices rose, curses flew, and snowballs laced with stones struck the soldier's coat. Thomas, his heart pounding, shouted with the others, his voice joining the cries of "No tyrants in Boston." When reinforcements arrived, gritted soldiers with muskets gleaming in the dim lantern light, the air grew taut with fear, and the crowd surged like a wave ready to break. Suddenly, a shot rang out, sharp and terrible, followed by a volley that cut through the cold night. Thomas saw men fall, blood staining the snow, and he stood frozen, his breath choking him as he realized what had happened. The Boston Massacre, as it would soon be called, etched itself into his soul that night, and when he returned home, pale and shaken, his family listened in horror as he recounted the scene, Margaret clutching Abigail's hand, while Jonathan's face darkened with both grief and foreboding. In the weeks that followed, Boston became a city of whispers and defiance. Funerals for the dead became rallies, and men like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere spread word of British cruelty through handbills and engravings. Thomas found himself drawn into the circles of young men who called themselves Sons of Liberty, men who gathered in taverns to speak of freedom, to plan protests, to vow that no unjust law of Parliament would go unchallenged. Jonathan, though sympathetic to the anger that burned in his son, warned him to be careful, to remember that Britain's power was vast, and that rash actions could bring ruin upon them all. Edward, however, grew more vocal in his loyalty to the crown, calling the dead of King Street agitators who had provoked soldiers only doing their duty. These arguments at the Whitfield dinner table grew more heated with each passing week, until Margaret would slam her hand upon the table to silence them, reminding her children that family must remain united, even when the world outside fell to pieces. By 1773, the storm of rebellion swelled to new heights. For Parliament's insistence upon taxing the colonies without representation ignited the people's fury. The Tea Act, passed that year, gave the East India Company the right to ship tea directly to the colonies at a lower price, but with a hidden tax that the colonists despised. To Britain it seemed a reasonable measure, but in Boston it was seen as a trap, a sly attempt to force the colonists to accept Parliament's right to tax them. The Whitfield household once again found itself divided. Jonathan, though angered, urged moderation, hoping that some compromise could still be found. Edward argued that the tea should be accepted, for even with the tax it was cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. But Thomas's voice, now confident, his eyes burning with conviction, declared that no man of honor could bow to tyranny, that to drink taxed tea was to accept chains. Abigail listened, her heart torn, but she felt herself moved by Thomas's passion. sensing that history itself was tilting toward some great and terrible change. It was in December of that year, on a cold night when the harbor waters lay dark beneath the winter sky, that Thomas slipped from the house and joined a band of men disguised as Mohawk Indians. Their faces blackened with soot, feathers in their hair. They crept through the streets until they reached Griffin's Wharf, where ships loaded with tea lay at anchor. Go with a shout, they swarmed aboard, and Thomas's hands, trembling but resolute, seized crates and hurled them into the water below. The harbor soon foamed with tea, the air filled with the sound of splintering wood and the shouts of defiance. It was an act of rebellion. The world would not forget the Boston Tea Party and Thomas. Breathless and exhilarated, knew that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. When he returned home in the early hours, smelling of salt water and smoke, Jonathan looked at him with a mixture of pride and dread. For he knew his son's path now lay tied to rebellion, and that their family would not escape the consequences. For in the days that followed, Britain's response was swift and merciless. The coercive acts soon called the intolerable acts by the colonists strangled Boston's trade, closed its harbor, and placed the city under martial law. Red-coated soldiers filled the streets, their boots echoing on cobblestones. Their presence a constant reminder that Boston lived under occupation. Edward, who had defended loyalty to the crown, now found himself mocked and distrusted by neighbors, while Thomas moved ever deeper into the world of resistance, attending secret meetings, smuggling messages, and swearing oaths of defiance. Abigail, still young but keenly observant, saw how her family teetered on the edge of fracture. Her brothers staring at one another with eyes that once held love but now flickered with suspicion. Margaret prayed nightly for peace, but even she could sense that the world they had known was slipping away, replaced by something larger, more dangerous, yet filled with the promise of destiny. By the end of 1773, Boston was no longer merely a city of trade and industry, but the tinderbox of a revolution. For the Whitfields, the storm that gathered over their home would test not only their loyalties to king or colony, but their very bonds as a family. The choices made in those years of gathering tension would ripple through their lives for generations, binding their fate to the birth of a nation. The winter wind carried a bitter edge through Boston's narrow streets in December of 1773. And with each gust, it seemed the city itself whispered of treachery and defiance. For the great argument over tea had reached its climax, and the people of Boston stood upon the threshold of history. In the Whitfield household, tension hung heavier than the frost upon the window panes. Thomas Whitfield, now 23, carried himself with the bearing of a man who had chosen his side. His words sharp and fervent whenever the subject of Parliament's laws arose. Edward, 2 years younger, still clung to his belief that the colonies were best served by remaining within the protective embrace of the British Empire, though the mockery he suffered at the hands of neighbors and friends had begun to shake his confidence. Their father, Jonathan, observed his sons with worry etched deep upon his brow, for he knew that the struggle tearing Boston apart had already reached his own family's hearth, and that no argument at the dinner table could mend what history itself was unraveling. When word spread that Governor Thomas Hutchinson would not permit the East India Company St. to be sent back to England, the people of Boston resolved upon action. Meetings at Faneuil Hall and the Old South Meeting House drew thousands. Men crammed shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in furious debate. No taxation without representation, they cried, the words echoing like a creed, and Thomas, pressed into the throng, felt the swell of unity surge within him. For weeks he had watched ships sit at anchor, their holds laden with tea. While customs officials awaited the governor's command, the law allowed but 20 days before the cargo must be unloaded and the duty paid. Yet the people of Boston swore that not a single leaf of taxed tea would ever touch their soil. On December 16th, as evening fell and the meeting house overflowed with citizens unwilling to yield, a signal passed silently through the crowd. A cry rang out, "This meeting can do no more to save the country," and men disguised as Mohawks surged into the night. Thomas, his face smeared with soot, feathers tied hastily in his hair, joined their number, his heart pounding as he felt the pull of destiny. The harbor lay cold and black beneath the winter sky, the masts of the ships standing like skeletal fingers against the stars. At Griffin's Wharf, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver sat heavy with their cargo. Lanterns swayed as the disguised men clambered aboard, their axes flashing, their shouts carrying across the water. Thomas's hands shook as he helped pry open the first crate, the scent of tea rising sharp and pungent as the leaves spilled out. And with a heave, he cast the chest into the dark waves below. One by one the crates followed, more than 300 in all, tumbling into the harbor until the water itself was stained with the bitter brew. Crowds gathered on shore, silent but resolute, watching the act unfold, as if knowing that this moment would echo beyond their lifetimes. Thomas, sweat freezing on his brow, felt both exhilaration and dread, for he knew he had crossed an invisible line, one that separated loyal subjects from rebels. When he returned home near dawn, his clothes reeking of salt and tea, Jonathan awaited him by the hearth, the fire casting long shadows across his face. No words were spoken at first, for Jonathan already knew. At last he said quietly, "You have thrown your lot with rebellion, Thomas. God help us all." Margaret, pale with fear, clasped her son's hand, but could not bring herself to scold him. For she saw in his eyes the fire of conviction that no parental warning could extinguish. Edward, however, stared at his brother with something close to betrayal. "Do you not see what you have done?" he hissed. "This is treason. The crown will not forgive such defiance. You have doomed us all." Thomas met his gaze with defiance. "I have done what honor demands. No man should bow to tyranny." And so the rift widened. The bond of brotherhood strained beneath the weight of history. The weeks that followed confirmed Edward's fears. News of the Tea Party spread like wildfire across the colonies, some praising the boldness of Boston, others condemning the destruction of property. In London, outrage thundered through Parliament. The king himself, George III, demanded punishment, and so were born the coercive acts of 1774, which the colonists named the Intolerable Acts. Boston's harbor was closed until the tea was paid for, a strangling blow to the city's lifeblood of trade. The Massachusetts charter was revoked, town meetings restricted, and soldiers quartered in private homes. British warships filled the harbor, their cannons trained upon the town, and redcoats marched through the streets with heavy boots and watchful eyes. Jonathan's business faltered as ships were turned away, the once bustling wharves now silent and idle. Hunger gnawed at the poorer families, and resentment burned hotter with each passing day. For Thomas, the crackdown only strengthened his resolve. He joined with men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who urged resistance and called for a continental congress of all colonies to unite against British oppression. He spent long nights copying pamphlets, smuggling messages, and speaking in hushed tones within tavern walls. Edward, however, found himself further isolated. His admiration for British order and might seemed now to mark him as an outcast, even a traitor in the eyes of his neighbors. More than once he returned home with bruises from scuffles in the street, his voice hoarse from shouting matches with those who accused him of siding with oppressors. Margaret pleaded with her sons to cease their quarreling, to remember that family must remain above politics, but the tide of events was too powerful for her words to stem. Abigail, though still only 16, watched with eyes sharpened by turmoil. She saw in Thomas a vision of courage and conviction, a young man willing to risk all for a principle. Yet she also saw in Edward the fear that gripped so many, the fear of losing stability, of provoking a war with the greatest power on earth. Her nights were restless, filled with dreams of soldiers marching, of flames consuming homes, of a world transformed beyond recognition. She prayed for peace, yet deep in her heart, she felt that peace was already lost. The arrival of General Thomas Gage in Boston in the spring of 1774 brought no relief. Tasked with enforcing the intolerable acts, he brought thousands of soldiers to occupy the city, turning Boston into a garrison. Fortifications rose on Boston Neck, and patrols swept the countryside. Jonathan, once cautious but loyal, now muttered bitterly of tyranny, for he saw his business ruined, his neighbors impoverished, his own liberty curtailed. Even he, who had counseled moderation, began to whisper that perhaps resistance was the only path left. In September, the First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia, and though no shots had yet been fired, the colonies stood more united than ever before. From Boston, messages carried the defiance of its people, and Thomas was proud to know his city as sacrifice had awakened the spirit of liberty across 13 colonies. Edward, though scornful, could not help but sense that history was shifting, and that his loyalty to Britain placed him on a narrowing path. By the year's end, the Whitfield family stood upon the edge of a precipice. Boston was strangled, the crown unyielding, and the colonies restless. Thomas prepared himself for whatever came next, whether protest, imprisonment, or war. Edward struggled with the knowledge that his beloved empire had become to many the face of tyranny. Jonathan felt the weight of generations pressing upon him, for he knew his children's futures would be forged in fire. Margaret prayed more fervently than ever, her rosary beads worn smooth by anxious fingers. And Abigail, though young, resolved to remember every detail, every word, every moment. For she sensed she was witnessing the birth pangs of something vast and terrible, something that might one day be called a nation. The winter of 1774 into the spring of 1775 found Boston under the heavy hand of military rule its streets. Patrolled by redcoats whose bayonets glinted in the pale sunlight, its harbor still closed, and silent its merchants broken by ruin.
Ow.
The Whitfield family felt the weight of this oppression as keenly as any. For Jonathan's trade had nearly collapsed, and each day the sound of marching boots reminded them that their city was no longer their own. Yet even in this atmosphere of fear and scarcity, a stubborn flame of defiance burned, and Thomas Whitfield fanned it with every breath he drew. He moved in secret meetings, slipped through alleys with messages, and filled tavern rooms with fiery words, his voice echoing the determination of men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who would not bow to the king. To Thomas, the closing of the harbor and the quartering of soldiers were not punishments but provocations, proof that tyranny would tighten its grip unless it was resisted with iron resolve. Edward, however, grew ever more isolated. He had once believed that his loyalty to the crown was shared by many, but as the months passed and the occupation deepened, he discovered that most of his neighbors now viewed him with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Where once he had spoken proudly of Britain's power, he now held his tongue. For too many times had he returned home with bruises from those who called him a Tory and spat at his feet. His heart ached with conflict. He could not abandon his belief in the empire that had nurtured his childhood. Yet he could not deny the suffering inflicted upon Boston by that same empire's hand. Margaret, his mother, tried to comfort him, but her own heart was torn. For she saw in her eldest son Thomas the spirit of rebellion, and in Edward the weight of loyalty, and she loved them both with equal fervor. Each night she prayed that Providence might guide them toward reconciliation, yet the world outside her door seemed bent upon driving them apart. The countryside around Boston hummed with secret activity. Men gathered in barns and backfields to drill with muskets, calling themselves Minutemen for their vow to be ready at a moment's notice. Powder and shot were hidden in cellars, iron cannons dragged into the woods beneath the cover of night. Riders carried messages from town to town, weaving a network of resistance that stretched far beyond Massachusetts. Thomas threw himself into this work with passion, his hands blistered from lifting crates of powder, his voice hoarse from drilling with the militia in the crisp dawn air. He knew the risk he ran for. The British authorities watched closely, and those suspected of sedition were threatened with arrest, but he could not stop. To him, each musket hidden, each man trained, was a step toward liberty. Abigail, though still young, observed all with sharp eyes. She watched her brother return home in the early hours, his clothes damp with sweat and dew, and though fear pricked at her, pride stirred within her as well. She began to write in her journal, a habit she kept faithfully, recording each rumor, each whisper of war, as if she sensed that future generations would hunger for the memory of these days. She sketched the faces of soldiers she passed in the street, the red of their coats, vivid in her mind's eye, and she wrote of the tension in her household, the way Edward avoided Thomas's gaze the way. Jonathan sat silent at supper, his jaw clenched, his heart heavy with worry. By early 1775, General Gage, the British commander, had grown wary of the restless colonists. He knew the countryside seethed with rebellion, and he had orders to stamp it out before it grew into open war. Spies reported stores of powder and weapons hidden in Concord, a mere 20 miles from Boston, and so he devised a plan. On the night of April 18th, detachments of British regulars would march secretly to Concord, seize the arms, and arrest the leaders Adams and Hancock, who were rumored to be near Lexington. but secrecy was impossible in a land where riders kept constant watch. The Patriot network stirred to life as lanterns flickered in the belfry of the Old North Church. One if by land, two if by sea, and Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott galloped into the night, their cries ringing across farm and field. The regulars are coming out. Thomas was awake when the alarm reached his ears. He seized his musket and powder horn, his hands trembling not with fear, but with anticipation. For he knew this was the moment toward which all his labors had pointed. He kissed his mother's cheek, whispered a promise to return, and vanished into the night. Abigail clutched the doorway, watching him disappear into the shadows, her heart pounding with dread. Edward, standing stiff by the hearth, muttered, "He rushes to his death." Yet even as he spoke, a part of him longed to follow, torn by the pull of brotherhood against conviction. The dawn of April 19th broke over Lexington with a chill mist, and upon the village green the Minutemen stewed a ragged line of farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants clutching their muskets, their faces pale but resolute. Captain John Parker, their leader, spoke quietly. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Into this tense silence marched the red-coated columns of British regulars, their drums beating, their bayonets gleaming. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the crack of a shot no one knew from where, whether from the line of militia or the ranks of soldiers, but in that instant the world changed. A ragged volley erupted, smoke curling across the green, and when it cleared, 8 colonists lay dead, their blood soaking the spring grass. The war had begun. Thomas was not at Lexington when the first shots were fired. But by the time the British pressed on toward Concord, he had joined the swelling ranks of militia streaming in from the countryside. The North Bridge became the scene of fierce resistance, the air thick with smoke and the cries of men. Thomas fired his musket, the recoil jolting his shoulder, the acrid taste of powder filling his mouth. He saw British soldiers stagger and fall, saw his neighbors fight with a ferocity born of desperation. And he knew in that instant that the Rubicon had been crossed. There could be no return to submission, no reconciliation without freedom. As the British retreated toward Boston, harried on every side by militia, firing from behind trees and stone walls, Thomas ran with the tide of his countrymen, his lungs burning, his spirit alight with the fire of revolution. News of the battles at Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire across the colonies. The myth of British invincibility had been shattered by farmers and tradesmen, and everywhere men took up arms, ready to join the fight. In the Whitfield home, the news fell with the weight of prophecy. Margaret wept for the dead, clutching Abigail close, while Jonathan sat in grim silence, knowing that the shadow of war had now descended fully upon them. Edward paced like a man imprisoned, torn between loyalty and blood. His anger at Thomas mingled with a gnawing fear that perhaps his brother had chosen rightly. "The king will crush this madness," he declared, yet his voice shook, betraying the doubt that ate at his heart. Boston itself soon became the stage of war. The militia, swelling into an army, besieged the city, cutting off the British garrison. Camps rose upon the surrounding hills, and smoke from countless campfires curled into the spring sky. Within the city walls, supplies dwindled, tempers flared, and fear stalked every street. The Whitfields found themselves trapped between two worlds. Thomas often slipping away to join the militia lines beyond the neck, Edward forced to keep silent lest he be branded a traitor, Margaret, struggling to keep her family safe amidst the chaos. Abigail wrote feverishly, her quill scratching late into the night, recording the sights and sounds of a city under siege, as if by writing she might impose order upon the turmoil. The summer brought the Battle of Bunker Hill, a clash that seared itself into memory. Though technically a British victory, the staggering losses inflicted by the Colonial militia proved that the rebellion was no mere riot, but a war in earnest. Thomas fought upon the Charlestown Peninsula, his ears ringing with cannon fire, his musket barrel hot in his hands. He saw men cut down beside him, heard the cries of the wounded, smelled the acrid stench of blood and powder. When at last the militia retreated, their powder spent, he stumbled back across the river, his clothes torn, his spirit both exhausted and unyielding. "We can stand against them," he told his father upon his return. "We have shown the world we will not bow." For Edward, Bunker Hill was a torment. He knew the might of Britain, knew that more regiments and ships would come. Yet he could not erase the image of his brother standing firm against impossible odds. Doubt gnawed at him more deeply than ever, for he felt himself divided, a man without a country, despised by patriots yet uncomforted by the distant crown. He wondered if perhaps history itself had abandoned men like him, leaving them stranded between two tides with no shore upon which to stand. Thus did the year 1775 close upon the Whitfields. Thomas aflame with the cause of liberty, Edward adrift in his loyalty, Jonathan grimly resigned to a war he had hoped to avoid, Margaret worn with fear, and Abigail recording it all with eyes wide open. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord had not merely begun a war. They had ignited a transformation of hearts, a reckoning that would sweep 13 colonies into the furnace of revolution. And in Boston, beneath the gaze of cannons and the shadow of ships, a family, like a nation, found itself forever changed. The dawn of April 19, 1775, broke cold and uncertain over the small villages of Lexington and Concord. Though for the Whitfield family in Boston, that morning marked the irreversible crossing of a threshold that would forever divide their lives into before and after. For weeks, the air had been thick with rumor. British regulars planned to march into the countryside, seize colonial stores of arms and powder, and capture rebel leaders. Thomas, already deep in the Sons of Liberty, had grown restless, unable to sleep, for he knew the colonies now stood on the edge of open war. Edward, still a loyalist at heart, watched with a kind of grim disbelief, certain that cooler heads must prevail. For surely the empire would never unleash its full military might against its own people. But history, as it so often does, had other plans. That night, messengers rode out from Boston, one of them Paul Revere himself. Their horses thundering through the dark, carrying the warning that the British were coming by land. Lanterns lit in church steeples sent signals across the countryside, and men roused from sleep grabbed muskets, powder horns, and leather cartridge boxes. Thomas was among them. He had slipped away from the house hours earlier, leaving only a brief note upon the table: "I must go where destiny calls." When Margaret found it in the morning, her hands trembled, and she pressed the note to her lips, whispering a prayer, knowing full well what that destiny meant. By the time the red-coated columns reached Lexington, the sun had only just begun to rise. On the green, a small band of militiamen, farmers, and blacksmiths, fathers and sons, stood with muskets in hand, uncertain yet determined. Their captain urged them not to fire unless fired upon. Among them, Thomas's heart beat like a drum, fear and resolve mingling in equal measure. Then, from somewhere no man could later say exactly where, a shot cracked the morning stillness. It was a single report, but its echo carried across continents and centuries. The British unleashed a volley, and men fell upon the grass, smoke and cries mingling in the air. Thomas found himself firing, reloading, firing again, his body moving almost without thought, driven by something larger than himself, something that felt like history itself pressing through his hands. The skirmish at Lexington quickly gave way to running battles along the road to Concord, where militias from nearby towns swarmed to the fight, shooting from behind stone walls and trees, harassing the retreating redcoats all the way back toward Boston. By day's end, nearly 300 British lay dead, wounded, or missing, and the colonies understood with a clarity that no speech or pamphlet could equal. The war had begun. Thomas, exhausted and grim, returned to the Whitfield home that evening, his clothes reeking of powder, his face smudged with smoke. Margaret wept as she held him, while Jonathan, though proud, looked at his son with a deep sadness, knowing that innocence had been lost forever. Edward, however, was not at home. He had gone to the British encampment, drawn by loyalty and perhaps by curiosity. But when he returned late that night, he and Thomas clashed with words as sharp as any blade. "You fired upon soldiers of the king," Edward accused, his face pale with fury. "You've made yourself a traitor." Thomas's reply burned with defiance. "No, brother. I fired upon tyrants who would see us slaves." Their voices carried through the small house, shaking Abigail to her core. For she loved them both, and could not bear the thought of her family torn asunder by the war. That now swept them into its grasp. In the weeks that followed, the siege of Boston began. Colonial militias surrounded the city, cutting off the British garrison within. Supplies dwindled, and tempers grew short. The Whitfields found themselves caught between two worlds. Thomas slipping away to drill with rebel forces, Edward keeping company with loyalists and officers, Jonathan trying desperately to hold his family together, and Margaret keeping the household steady through sheer will and prayer. Abigail, though still young, began writing in a hidden journal, pouring her fears and hopes onto the page, sensing that one day her words might be all that remained of the life they had known. The tension reached a breaking point in June. With the Battle of Bunker Hill, though technically a British victory, the heavy losses inflicted upon the Redcoats proved that the colonists would not be easily subdued. Thomas fought on those heights, the smell of powder choking his lungs, the roar of cannon splitting the air, while Margaret and Abigail waited anxiously at home, straining for any scrap of news. Edward, meanwhile, found himself torn, for though he sympathized with British authority, he could not entirely suppress the pride he felt at his countrymen's courage. For the first time, doubt crept into his heart, though he tried to bury it beneath layers of loyalty and reason. By the end of 1775, Boston was a city besieged, divided, and hungry. And the Whitfield family stood at the very fault line of the coming revolution. For Thomas, the die had been cast. He would fight for liberty no matter the cost. For Edward, the conflict between blood and allegiance deepened with every passing day. For Jonathan and Margaret, their greatest fear was not the loss of home or livelihood, but the loss of their children to a war that seemed only to grow more merciless. And for Abigail, who watched and listened and wrote, the world felt both terrifying and vast, as though she lived at the very heart of a story that future generations would one day call the birth of a nation. The winter of 1775 into 1776 weighed heavily upon Boston. Snow drifted deep against the shuttered houses, and food grew scarce within the besieged city. British soldiers patrolled the cobblestone streets, their boots crunching through the frost while beyond the town. Colonial militias held their lines firm, determined to starve the Redcoats out. Within this frozen crucible, the Whitfield family clung to one another, their household divided, yet unbroken. Thomas returned home less and less, spending long weeks with the rebel army outside the city, his hands calloused by drill and his shoulders stiff with the burden of command among his neighbors. Edward remained in Boston proper, increasingly intertwined with loyalist circles, defending the authority of the crown even as he saw suffering all around him. Margaret and Jonathan did what they could to keep bread upon the table, while young Abigail filled page after page with her observations, her small hand cramping as she recorded words that she could scarcely comprehend in full. It was in January that a pamphlet swept through the colonies like wildfire, Common Sense. Written by a man named Thomas Paine, its words stripped away hesitation and dressed the conflict in the boldest terms. Reconciliation was a fantasy. Monarchy was tyranny, and independence was the only path forward. Thomas smuggled a copy into the Whitfield household and read it aloud by the dim glow of candlelight, his voice thick with passion. Margaret listened with worry, for she saw the fire in her son's eyes grow brighter with every page. Jonathan leaned upon his cane and said little, though deep inside, he too felt the pull of Paine's words, the sense that history demanded a new birth. Edward, however, rejected it with scorn. Rebellion. Disguised as philosophy, he spat, his face pale in the wavering light. This man would see our land drenched in blood for the sake of his pen. The quarrel that followed was fierce, Margaret weeping as her sons hurled accusations, while Abigail scribbled quietly in her journal, her child's heart heavy with the weight of words she could not fully grasp. Spring brought a great turning. In March, General George Washington, now commander of the Continental Army, positioned cannons upon Dorchester Heights, weapons dragged from Fort Ticonderoga across icy wilderness by sheer will and muscle. When the British awoke to see the guns looming over their position, they knew the city was lost. Within days, the Redcoats and Loyalist families evacuated Boston by ship, sailing away under cloudy skies. For the Whitfields, it was both liberation and loss. Thomas rejoiced. Edward seethed. Margaret gave thanks for the city's deliverance. Jonathan feared what wider war would follow now that Boston's siege had ended. Abigail, pressed against the window, watched the fleet depart, sails billowing like ghostly wings, and wondered if her brother Edward's heart sailed away with them. The war spread swiftly southward, battles raging in New York and New Jersey, where Washington's army, though brave, suffered defeat after defeat. The Whitfields received letters from Thomas, ink smudged and words hurried, describing retreats through mud and snow, yet always clinging to hope. "We have not lost, Father," he wrote, "for the cause is greater than our suffering. So long as we breathe, liberty endures." Margaret clutched those letters to her chest as though they were lifelines, while Edward grew ever more distant. Railing against the folly of rebellion and secretly meeting with British sympathizers who remained, the gulf between the brothers had widened into a chasm. Jonathan could no longer bridge it with patient words or stern counsel. Then, in the summer of 1776, news arrived that forever altered the world. The Continental Congress in Philadelphia had declared independence. On July 4th, the Declaration was adopted, and copies spread swiftly by horse and press. In Boston, the parchment was read aloud upon the common to cheering crowds. Bells pealed, cannons roared, and the words of Thomas Jefferson, "All men are created equal," echoed through the streets. Thomas, though far away with the army, felt the thunder of those words in his soul, writing home that he had never known such a sense of purpose. Edward, upon hearing them, turned pale with rage, muttering that treason had now been enshrined as law. Margaret, though fearful, wept openly, sensing that her son's sacrifices were no longer in vain, but tied to something eternal. Jonathan bowed his head, whispering a prayer that liberty, once birthed, might not devour his family in the struggle. Abigail, her eyes wide, copied the words of the Declaration into her journal, pressing hard with her quill as though she could carve them into eternity itself. But independence was not merely words, it was blood and hardship. Through that fallen winter, Washington's army staggered from defeat to retreat, until at last, on a cold December night, they crossed the icy Delaware and struck at Trenton, seizing a victory that revived the cause. Thomas was there, soaked to the bone, musket shaking in his frostbitten hands, yet filled with a fire that no winter could quench. He wrote to Abigail, telling her to hold fast, for dawn always followed the darkest night. Edward, meanwhile, saw British forces regroup in New York and believed firmly that the rebellion's days were numbered. Yet in his private heart, he could not forget the fire in his brother's eyes, nor the cheers of the crowds that had greeted the Declaration. By the year's end, the Whitfields were no longer a family untouched by history. They were bound, bruised, and divided by it. Thomas marched beneath Washington's banner. Edward, though still in Boston, leaned ever closer toward the crown. Margaret prayed over every meal. Jonathan grew weary and frail, his health fading beneath the weight of worry. And Abigail, still scribbling in her journal, began to sense that her family's story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the great upheaval of a people seeking to define themselves. Independence was declared. But whether it could be one was a question written not upon parchment but upon the battlefield, in smoke, fire, and the blood of sons. The year 1777 dawned with cold winds and dim hopes. The Declaration had set the colonies ablaze with fervor, but fervor alone could not hold ground against Britain's might. Washington's army was worn thin, its soldiers ragged and hungry, many without shoes, their feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. In Boston, the Whitfields clung to scraps of news, Margaret anxiously awaiting letters from her eldest, while Edward's loyalty to the crown hardened with each colonial setback. Abigail, not yet 12, filled her journal with sketches of soldiers she had never seen. Banners she imagined, and questions no one could answer. Could freedom truly be won? Or was it but a dream? In the spring, British forces launched a new campaign, intent on cutting the colonies in two by seizing the Hudson River Valley. General Burgoyne marched down from Canada with a grand army, expecting loyalist support and an easy triumph. Thomas Whitfield, now hardened by 2 years of campaigning, found himself among the soldiers called north to resist. The march was brutal, through forests choked with mud, where mosquitoes swarmed and supplies ran thin. Yet, for the first time, Thomas sensed a growing resolve among the men. They were no longer farmers with muskets. They were soldiers of a nation struggling to be born. Back in Boston, Edward's world shifted. Loyalists, once emboldened, found themselves increasingly shunned. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now turned their faces. Whispers followed him in the market, and his work as a clerk grew thin as patriot merchants refused his services. Margaret begged him to soften his stance, to think of family before politics. but Edward could not. "Honor is not a cloak to be shed when convenient," he told her, though in the solitude of night. He felt the sting of loneliness keenly. Jonathan, aged and weary, urged reconciliation, but the distance between his sons seemed unbridgeable. Summer wore on, and Burgoyne's march turned from triumph to disaster. Harassed by colonial militias, his supply lines stretched thin. His native allies disheartened, the grand British advance slowed to a crawl. In October, near Saratoga, the two sides clashed in battles that shook the northern wilderness. Thomas, musket in hand, charged through smoke and thunder, heart pounding as he saw redcoats falter before the relentless push of farmers and blacksmiths turned soldiers. He felt fear, how could he not? Yet also a rising certainty that the tide could turn. When Burgoyne finally surrendered, the news raced like lightning across the colonies. For the first time, the Patriots had captured not just a victory, but an entire British army. The Whitfields felt the impact immediately. Thomas wrote home, his letter brimming with pride. "The world must see now that we are no rabble. France will see. Liberty will see." Abigail copied his words into her journal, underlining them again and again. Margaret wept with relief, while Edward sat silent, his jaw clenched, knowing what this meant. The rebellion was no longer a hopeless cause. Even he could not deny that Saratoga changed everything, and indeed, it did. In 1778, France entered the war on the side of the colonies, bringing ships, gold, and soldiers. A rebellion had become a revolution with allies, yet even as hope swelled, suffering deepened. For Washington's army, the winter of 1777–78 at Valley Forge became a crucible of endurance. Thomas marched there with his regiment, his body already worn by years of hardship, his spirit tested by the endless hunger and cold. Huts of log and mud barely shielded the men from the freezing winds. Disease swept through the camp, felling hundreds. At night, Thomas lay awake, listening to the groans of the sick, and the cries of men who had given their last strength. But within that suffering, something profound took root. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, drilled the men with precision and discipline, turning a ragged mob into a true army. Thomas, though weary, learned the drills, his musket movements sharpening, his sense of belonging deepening. He wrote to Abigail of von Steuben's barked orders, of the laughter that sometimes broke out even in the coldest nights, and of the strange mixture of despair and determination that bound the soldiers together. "We are forged by this winter," he told her. "When we march again, we will march as one." In Boston, Margaret clung to each letter as though it were life itself. Edward, though still loyal in name, felt his position crumble further. Neighbors whispered not just of politics but of betrayal. Once on a walk through town, he was jeered by boys waving scraps of cloth painted as flags. He returned home shaken, and though he still defended the crown in words, in his heart he began to wonder if his loyalty was to a power already fading. Jonathan, whose health declined steadily, called his sons to him whenever they visited, urging them to remember blood above banners. But as months passed, he saw more clearly that the war had claimed them both, in spirit, if not in body. By the spring of 1778, when the snows melted at Valley Forge, Thomas marched forth with an army transformed. The men were lean, scarred, but disciplined, their muskets gleaming, their steps sure. They had survived hell, and in surviving had become something new. Across the Atlantic, kings and ministers recognized it too. The colonies were not merely rebellious children, but a nation in the making. Abigail, writing in her journal that spring, captured it in her childish hand. "We are no longer just the Whitfields of Boston. We are part of something that belongs to everyone. It is bigger than us, but we are inside it." She did not fully grasp the weight of her words, but someday historians would. For in her small scrawls lay the truth of a people transforming under fire. The Whitfield family, fractured yet bound, stood at the heart of this storm. One son bore arms for liberty. One clung to the crown yet trembled at its fading grasp. A mother prayed, a father dwindled, and a daughter chronicled it all with innocent yet unflinching eyes. The revolution was no longer a spark, it was a wildfire. The Whitfields, like the nation itself, could not escape its flames. The years following Valley Forge carried both triumphs and trials. And for the Whitfields, the war's long shadow crept ever closer into their private lives. Boston had changed. Once bustling with loyal merchants and crown officials, the city had grown more fervently revolutionary as British influence waned. Redcoat patrols no longer marched its cobblestones. The royal governor had long fled. Instead, committees of correspondence, militias, and patriot leaders filled the vacuum, steering the colony with a fiery determination. Edward Whitfield, once a man of standing, now found himself increasingly isolated, his loyalty to the king a mark of suspicion and scorn. Thomas, hardened by years in the Continental Army, returned briefly in the spring of 1779. He had grown lean, his face lined, and his eyes older than his 24 years. Abigail, now in her teens, stared in awe at the brother she barely recognized. He was no longer the eager youth who had marched off with pride, but a man tempered by hunger, fear, and discipline. Margaret clung to him as if he were a ghost who might vanish again. Jonathan, frail and confined mostly to bed, smiled faintly at the sight of his son in uniform. His pride mingled with sorrow. The reunion, however, brought more tension than peace. Edward greeted Thomas stiffly, his words polite but cold. Around the dinner table, their talk turned quickly to the war. Thomas spoke of courage at Saratoga, of endurance at Valley Forge, of the French alliance bringing new hope. Edward countered with warnings of chaos, of rebellion leading only to ruin, of Britain's inevitable return with overwhelming force. Their voices rose, Margaret pleading for calm, Abigail scribbling furiously in her journal by candlelight as if capturing every word could contain the storm. Finally, Thomas slammed his fist upon the table. "You speak of loyalty to a king across the sea, Edward, but what of loyalty to your family, to your people here, to liberty?" Edward's face flushed, his voice sharp. "Liberty? It is a word for mobs and dreamers. Order, law, tradition, that is what sustains a people. You will bring us all to ruin." The brothers left the table in anger, the gulf between them deeper than ever. That night, Abigail wrote, "Two brothers sit under one roof, yet live in different worlds. I fear one day the world will force them to choose not just words but weapons." The war itself shifted southward in 1779. As British strategy turned toward the Carolinas and Georgia, where loyalist sentiment seemed stronger, battles erupted in unfamiliar swamps and pine forests, the fighting brutal and bitter, often neighbor against neighbor. Thomas, though stationed largely in the north, heard of these struggles with unease, sensing the conflict was becoming less a war of armies and more a war of communities torn in two. Back in Boston, Edward's situation grew perilous. Loyalists had once hoped the British fleet would retake the city, but years passed with no such return. Many fled to Nova Scotia or New York, clinging to the crown's protection. Edward, stubborn and unwilling to abandon his home, endured the slow erosion of his world. His shop was vandalized, his name whispered with contempt. Even Margaret could not shield him from the town's suspicion. Only Jonathan, too frail to rise from bed, urged both sons to remember kinship above all. In the winter of 1780, tragedy struck. Jonathan Whitfield passed away quietly one night. His hand clasped by Margaret's, his final breath a faint whisper of reconciliation. "My sons, remember you are brothers." The loss cut deeply. Thomas, granted brief leave, returned to mourn, while Edward stood by in stiff silence, grief warring with pride. At the graveside, the brothers exchanged no words, but the tension between them hung like ice in the air. Abigail wept openly, her tears falling upon the soil as she wrote later, "Father is gone. The earth takes him, but his words remain. Will his sons honor them, or will the war bury them too?" Even as the Whitfields wrestled with loss, the war's harsh reality pressed on. The winter of 1779 to 1780 was one of the coldest in memory. Rivers frozen, supplies scarce. Soldiers mutinied in Pennsylvania, weary of broken promises and empty stomachs. Thomas marched again, enduring frost and hunger, yet clinging to the hope that their sacrifices were not in vain. He thought often of Abigail, of Margaret's quiet prayers, and even of Edward, whose face haunted him not with love but with the ache of estrangement. For Edward, the winter was no less cruel. Stripped of business, shunned in public, he clung stubbornly to his loyalty to Britain, even as it brought him misery. Yet in private moments he questioned. The Crown had promised protection, but Boston remained in Patriot hands. His friends among the Loyalists had fled, his neighbors eyed him with suspicion. Was he clinging to honor or merely to pride? He could not answer, and so he steeled himself in silence. The year 1780 would prove pivotal for both the Revolution and the Whitfields. Abroad, Britain pressed its southern campaign, seizing Charleston and sending waves of refugees northward. At home, General Benedict Arnold's betrayal shocked the colonies, reminder that loyalty was fragile, that men could turn for gold or bitterness. Thomas, upon hearing of Arnold's treachery, felt the wound deeply. If such a revered general could betray them, who could be trusted? He wrote to Abigail, "The enemy is not always across the field. Sometimes he walks beside you, wears your uniform, shares your bread. That is the bitterest lesson of this war." Abigail, in her quiet room in Boston, copied those words into her journal. She was no longer a child, but a young woman, her eyes sharpened by the years of war. She longed for peace, yet feared that even victory would not heal the rift between her brothers. Watching Edward brood in silence, watching Margaret pray each night by Jonathan's empty chair, Abigail felt the weight of history pressing upon her family. The Revolution was not just battles and declarations, it was a fire that consumed homes, kinships, and hearts. By the year's end, the Whitfields stood at a crossroads. Thomas marched south, his regiment ordered to reinforce the struggling armies in the Carolinas. Edward remained in Boston, his loyalty to the crown tested by loneliness and doubt. Margaret clung to faith, Abigail to her pen, and Jonathan, though buried, remained a voice in their hearts, his final plea echoing louder as the war dragged on. "Remember, you are brothers." But as the Revolution raged into its 6th year, it seemed that plea would be tested not by words, but by blood. By 1780, the Revolution had shifted from the cobbled streets of Boston and the forests of New England to the wide, humid expanses of the southern colonies. The British High Command believed that the Carolinas and Georgia would yield Loyalist support. And for a time, it seemed their strategy succeeded. Charleston fell, one of the worst defeats for the Continental Army. And British redcoats marched boldly through plantations and towns, flags snapping in the southern wind. Yet the war here was unlike anything Thomas Whitfield had experienced. It was intimate, brutal, and merciless. Neighbor turned on neighbor, homes were burned, and ambushes in swamps and pine barrens became the rule rather than the exception. Thomas had left Boston months earlier, parting from Edward with stiff silence, his heart heavy with unresolved conflict. Margaret had kissed his brow, and Abigail pressed a folded scrap of paper into his hand with words of encouragement. Now, marching through cypress swamps and along rivers sluggish with heat, Thomas found a land unlike his northern home. Plantations stretched across the horizon, their enslaved laborers toiling under overseers' whips, while the air thickened with humidity and the smell of pine resin. The war here tested more than strength. It tested endurance, courage, and moral fortitude. Patriot militias employed guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and disappearing into the dense forests. Loyalist neighbors retaliated with equal ferocity. Battles erupted in small towns, fields, and crossroads, leaving bloodied earth and shattered lives. Thomas's letters to Abigail captured the raw reality. This is not a war of neat formations and drums. Houses are torched, crops destroyed, men killed in their fields. Liberty is purchased not with speeches, but with ashes and sorrow. Abigail copied his words into her journal, reading between the lines the weight of command. The grief of fallen comrades and the gnawing hunger of long marches. The year brought both calamity and glimmers of hope. At Camden in 1780, the Continental Army suffered a devastating defeat. Troops scattering under British bayonets, Thomas narrowly survived the chaos, witnessing smoke choke the fields and hearing the screams of the wounded. In his journal, he wrote, "We are beaten, yet not broken," though inside he feared the rebellion teetered on ruin. Yet resistance persisted. Guerrilla leaders such as Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harried British forces with lightning raids, keeping the spirit of resistance alive. Patriot militias triumphed at Kings Mountain and later Cowpens in early 1781. Thomas fought at Cowpens, standing among Continentals who feigned retreat, luring British cavalry into a deadly trap before turning to fire with precision. The victory lifted morale, and Thomas allowed himself the rare luxury of a smile. "We are not finished," he wrote to Abigail. "The fire still burns." Meanwhile, Edward Whitfield lingered in Boston. Feeling the tide shift, yet weighed down by his loyalty to the crown, his business, already strained by conflict, now carried the stigma of suspicion. Even former friends avoided him. He withdrew into his father's study, pacing and reading London newspapers with bitterness. Though unable to renounce his allegiance publicly, he privately questioned his choices, wondering if pride had led him into a self-imposed exile. Margaret prayed for both her sons, her health weakening under the strain, while Abigail tended her mother by candlelight, penning letters in the hope that her words could bridge the distance. Spring 1781 saw the British press further into Virginia. Thomas marched north under General Nathaniel Greene, skirmishing and shadowing Cornwallis's forces. Greene's strategy of attrition kept the enemy off balance, sapping strength without committing to full-scale battles. Thomas endured relentless marches, ambushes, and the constant presence of death. Abigail's letters became his lifeline. "Though he speaks not of you, no, he thinks of you," she wrote, referencing Edward's silent concern. Thomas read these words by firelight, the ink smudged, pondering whether reconciliation was possible or if the war had forged an irreparable chasm. By summer, Cornwallis entrenched at Yorktown, confident in his position but unaware that a trap had been set. Washington, marching south with French allies, and the French Navy blocking escape by sea, prepared to strike. Thomas, exhausted but resolute, advanced with his regiment, hope flickering despite the weight of months of hardship. Back in Boston, Edward listened to news of Yorktown with dread. His loyalty now seemed a liability, his empire distant and faltering. Jonathan Whitfield's words pleas for brotherhood in his mind, and he longed to reconcile with Thomas, though he could not voice his doubt. He sat alone, staring into the hearth, contemplating the world that would emerge once the smoke cleared. As autumn approached, the stage was set for the war's climactic moments. Armies converged on Yorktown. Cannons rumbled, drums echoed across the fields, and soldiers prepared for the final confrontation. For Thomas, it was the culmination of years of frost, hunger, fear, and endurance. For Edward, it was a reckoning of loyalty, pride, and lost time. For Abigail and Margaret, it was a season of vigil, fear, and hope. The Whitfields, like the colonies themselves, stood on the precipice of history. The Southern campaign had burned fiercely, testing courage, loyalty, and morality. Now the fire rose in Virginia, where the fate of a nation and the reunion of two estranged brothers would soon be decided. By the late summer of 1781, the war had moved south, and the Whitfields found themselves caught in the decisive moment of history. Thomas Whitfield, seasoned by years of marches, skirmishes, and guerrilla tactics in the Carolinas, now marched with General George Washington and the French Allied forces toward Yorktown, Virginia. The British, led by General Cornwallis, had entrenched themselves in what they believed was a defensible port. Yet the alliance of American and French forces had cut off every escape route, land and sea alike. The Continental Army advanced with cautious determination. Thomas's regiment, ragged yet disciplined, dug trenches, moved artillery, endured days of stifling heat and relentless mosquito swarms. Nights were filled with anxious whispers, prayers, and the quiet shuffling of men tending their wounded comrades. Thomas wrote to Abigail whenever he could, his letters detailing the precise, grueling work of the siege. "We move like shadows, digging and firing, inching closer while the enemy hunkers behind walls that will not long hold. Cornwallis believes himself strong, but starvation and fear weaken even the proudest soldier." Inside Yorktown, British officers fretted over dwindling supplies and the impossibility of reinforcements. Soldiers huddled in alleys and fortifications, counting rations and hoping for relief that would not come. Thomas, observing from the trenches, understood the psychological as well as physical toll of the siege. Every cannon blast, every volley of musket fire sapped the enemy's morale as the Americans and French tightened the noose. October 14th saw a critical assault on British redoubts. Thomas, leading a flanking maneuver, faced a deadly mix of musket fire, cannonballs, and the chaos of battle. Sweat and blood mixed on the ground, and men fell around him, some never to rise. Yet the coordinated attack succeeded. The British lines fractured under pressure, and cheers erupted from the American trenches. For the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself a glance at hope. The culmination of years of hardship seemed within reach. As the siege continued, a figure appeared near the Continental lines, Edward Whitfield. He had traveled in secret from Boston, compelled by concern for his brother and the rumors of Cornwallis's impending surrender. Pride and fear held his steps for weeks, yet the pull of family and the desire to witness history firsthand propelled him forward. When Thomas finally saw Edward approaching, both men froze. Years of estrangement hung between them, yet the immediacy of danger and the presence of victory softened rigid pride. Edward approached quietly. "Thomas," he said, voice low but steady. Thomas extended a calloused hand, gripping his brother's firmly. Words were few, but the embrace bridged years of silence and disagreement. "We fought well," Edward murmured. "We did what we thought was right." Thomas nodded, a mix of relief and lingering grief in his eyes. "We survived. That is enough." On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis struck his colors. The formal surrender of the British marked the decisive moment of the Revolution. Thomas watched as lines of redcoats marched past, stacking their arms in surrender. The battlefield filled with the smoke of victory and the cries of relief. Abigail and Margaret, awaiting news in Boston, read Thomas's letters with tears streaming down their faces, the words painting the triumph and exhaustion of final victory. Edward's correspondence soon followed, admitting regrets and offering the promise of restored bonds. For the Whitfields, Yorktown was more than a military triumph. It was the reconciliation of a family divided by loyalty and circumstance. History had turned, and the nation they had fought to shape now took its first unsteady steps into freedom. Thomas, Edward, Abigail, and Margaret were forever changed by the events. Knowing that courage, sacrifice, and forgiveness had secured both liberty and family unity. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally ended the war, confirming American independence. For the Whitfields, the return to civilian life was both joyful and uncertain. Boston had survived occupation and turmoil. Its streets gradually came alive with commerce, civic engagement, and the reconstruction of homes and institutions. Families who had been divided by ideology now struggled to coexist in a new republic, just as the Whitfields had navigated personal reconciliation. Thomas Whitfield, hardened by years of campaigning, returned to his family with a sense of cautious optimism. He worked in Boston's harbor, using his knowledge of logistics to help rebuild trade routes disrupted by war. He also took an active role in local civic affairs, ensuring that veterans received care and that the stories of their sacrifices were recorded for posterity. His children, born in the wake of victory, would inherit not the hardships of war, but the lessons of courage, resilience, and civic responsibility. Edward, whose loyalty to Britain had once divided the family, now embraced the new reality. He revived the family business, using his acumen to navigate a recovering economy. Neighbors who had once viewed him with suspicion now sought his counsel, and Edward gradually restored his reputation, demonstrating that honor could be reclaimed through integrity rather than empire. The reconciliation with Thomas deepened over shared enterprise and mutual respect, bridging the gap that years of ideological division had created. Margaret's health stabilized, and she spent her days tending to the family and mentoring her grandchildren. Abigail remained the chronicler of the Whitfield story, preserving letters, journals, and accounts of the war. She also became involved in education and community work, advocating literacy and care for widows and orphans, ensuring that the Revolution's human legacy endured beyond battlefields and treaties. The Whitfield story mirrored that of the nation. Communities scarred by neighbor-against-neighbor violence slowly rebuilt. New institutions emerged, from schools to local councils, echoing the ideals fought for in the Revolution. Freedom, once the abstract aspiration of pamphlets and speeches, became a lived reality, shaped by the daily work, moral courage, and compromise of citizens. In quiet moments, Thomas and Edward would walk Boston's harbor, reflecting on the years of conflict, the bitter pride of disagreement, the fragile beauty of reconciliation. The war had tested them in every conceivable way through danger, loss, and ideological conflict, but it had also forged a lasting bond, grounded in shared endurance and love for family. Abigail's writings preserved these moments, offering future generations a glimpse of the human cost and triumphs behind the headlines of history. By the late 1780s and early 1790s, the Whitfields had established stability and purpose. Thomas and Edward worked together to secure the family legacy. Abigail's chronicles circulated among friends and family, and Margaret found solace in the rhythms of domestic life. The nation itself, young and untested, began to define its principles, experimenting with governance, justice, and civic responsibility. The Whitfields, having endured the Revolution firsthand, understood that liberty was both a prize and a duty. Their story closed not with musket fire, but with the quiet rhythms of life children's laughter, the bustle of trade, the ink of letters, and the warmth of home. The Whitfields had survived the fire of rebellion, and from it emerged a family united, a household resilient, and a nation poised to grow. The legacy of their courage, sacrifice, and reconciliation endured, a testament to the power of family and the human spirit in shaping history. The sons and daughters of liberty had done more than fight a war. They had lived it, survived it, and laid the foundation for a new dawn in America.